dungeon master makes the rules. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and recently somebody left a comment that, well, I think they intended it as a little jab at bureaucrats, but in reality, they touched on a deep and fundamental truth about our world. They said, "That just sounds like Dungeons and Dragons." And believe it or not, that's almost exactly what's going on. For those of you unfamiliar with Dungeons and Dragons, it's a tabletop role-playing game where a bunch of heroes, the players, adventure into some subterranean dungeon or creepy swamp. The game has a complex set of rules that goes on and on and on for a whole series of books, and then there's just tons of random events that are driven by this whole array of different sized dice. And it's all overseen by a participant called the Dungeon Master, who functions kind of like a narrator and a bit like a referee. There are about as many variations on how you can play Dungeons and Dragons as there are groups of people playing with it. I mean, some group of 30-somethings playing in 2025 is certainly going to be doing it differently than my middle school friends and I did back in the 80s. But here is the real point about Dungeons and Dragons and how it connects to bureaucracy. Despite all the rules and the dice throws, it is just a story that the players are telling themselves. It's just an illusion, and the Dungeon Master can shape that story just about any way he chooses to. To a certain extent. I mean, certainly more than people like to admit, that is how strategic bureaucratic decision-making actually happens. It's all just a story that we're telling ourselves and the public. I mean, you have rules like the U.S. Code and executive orders and regulations, and sure, there's all sorts of analytical events like the random probability that a certain person is going to retire, but in the end, it's all just a story. Now, don't take that lightly. I mean, the story does have to make sense, and the story does have to follow some basic rules of logic. And of course, the story also has to adapt to unpredictable external events, but that just makes the whole analogy that much stronger. Now, if you've never had the experience of a Dungeons and Dragons group that imploded on itself, hopefully you can imagine how a player who doggedly clung to the rules, the kind of person who's cross-referencing the criminal personality table against the climate data for a subtemperate urban area, how that kind of person could bog the game down so it felt like a trigonometry exam. And at the same time, you could have some freewheeling maverick who just ignores the storyline and goes wandering off on bizarre side quests. They're like, "Well, I wonder who painted the picture of the innkeeper's grandmother, and I wonder where that painter is today." They completely derail any sense of progress. Well, both of those forces exist at headquarters, and they spend a lot of time frustrating the people around them, each other, and sometimes themselves. Ooh, and do not forget the heroes. You know, a lot of people play Dungeons and Dragons to get the vicarious thrill of being the heroes who rescue the town from the rock trolls. They're trying to live out some version of their lives that they've otherwise been denied. I mean, that's why I always play as a big, strong warrior. Just because it's role-playing. And not for nothing, but the cubicle farms of headquarters teem with these would-be, wannabe heroes. They're all just looking for their chance to come to the rescue, and they're just craving the adulation of grateful townfolk. But so what? I mean, how silly am I being right now? Well, maybe a little, but you've heard me say that bureaucracy is a human competition over the distribution of resources. It's a human game, just like Dungeons and Dragons. And even more so, when I say bureaucracy is about the distribution of resources, it's really about withholding those resources. It's about preventing that distribution. Or, as one of you put it, bureaucracy is the art of making the possible impossible. It is the art of saying no. But if you're going to be saying no to people, it helps if you can spin a compelling yarn that brings together a complex set of rules and these random, unpredictable external events and just enough promise of victory to keep them coming back for more. Now, what do you do with this particular piece of wisdom? Well, maybe don't tell people, because you'll get funny looks. But you don't have to look very far to see this playing out. In fact, you can start with how the services describe their readiness. I mean, readiness may be number one, but at the strategic level, it's a highly subjective concept. It's just a story. And how the services tell their own particular story, well, that's fascinating in and of itself.